A soaked woman in a hoodie steps into Chicago's most exclusive hotel, only to be humiliated by a smug receptionist who has no idea she's just insulted Sandra Bullock. But when Keanu Reeves walks through the door minutes later, everything changes. What he does next leaves the entire lobby in stunned silence. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The rain came down in sheets, casting a silver sheen over downtown Chicago. Reflections of red brake lights shimmered in the puddles that pooled near the curb. It was the kind of night when people rushed indoors, huddled under umbrellas, or ducked into the warmth of restaurants and hotels. But one figure moved slowly, deliberately, her steps calm even as the wind tugged at her hood. Sandra Bullock walked with her head down, a plain black hoodie pulled over her head and a baseball cap shadowing her face. No makeup, no entourage, no designer heels, just jeans, running shoes, and a quiet determination to remain unseen. She hadn't come for glamour. Tomorrow morning, she was scheduled to speak at a closed-door panel for a humanitarian film initiative, something she'd agreed to months ago. Tonight, she just needed a quiet night of rest. Privacy, peace, and no spotlight. That was all she wanted. So she chose the Bellcourt Hotel, known for its discretion, its world-class service, and the promise that no one would bother you if you didn't want to be seen. As she approached the entrance, a doorman held the heavy glass door open without fanfare. Sandra gave him a quiet nod and stepped inside. The lobby was as stunning as she remembered. Towering ceilings with golden trim, soft jazz playing in the background, and the calming scent of polished wood and lavender in the air. Guests moved gracefully across the floor, most dressed in tailored coats and sleek boots, sipping champagne by the fireplace or checking in with designer luggage in tow. Sandra didn't bring attention. She moved straight to the front desk, her overnight duffel bag over her shoulder. Behind the gleaming marble counter stood a young woman in a navy blazer with a gold name tag that read Heather. Her hair was tightly pulled back, her expression precise and unreadable. But the moment her eyes met Sandra's outfit, something flickered. Judgment, subtle but sharp. Sandra offered a polite smile. "Hi, I have a reservation under the name Sandra Annette." Heather raised a brow. Her gaze swept from Sandra's sneakers to her damp hoodie. The pause was almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Then she responded with a clipped tone. "Good evening. May I see your ID, please?" Sandra reached into her hoodie pocket, pulled out her ID and the email confirmation from her phone, and handed them over calmly. Heather took them without a word. She stared at the screen, her expression unchanged. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but they didn't move. "We don't seem to have any VIP bookings under that name," she said flatly. Sandra blinked. "Could you check again? The reservation was made weeks ago." Heather gave a tight smile and turned slightly, still not typing. "I'll try, but our system is very specific." Sandra glanced down at her phone, still displaying the email. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't push back. But already, the weight of what was happening settled quietly around her. Heather finally tapped a few keys, eyes flicking between the screen and Sandra with mechanical precision. The glow of the monitor illuminated her cheekbones, but there was no urgency in her fingers, no real attempt to locate anything. Sandra watched closely. She'd dealt with this before, too many times. The look of someone who had already made up their mind. "I'm sorry," Heather said after a few seconds. "There's just no reservation under that name." Sandra remained still. Her voice was soft, but unshaken. "I have the confirmation right here." She held up her phone again, turning the screen toward Heather. The subject line of the email read clearly, "Reservation confirmed. Sandra Annette, Bellcourt Hotel." Heather barely glanced at it. "Yes, well, the system doesn't seem to reflect that. Perhaps there was a glitch." There was a pause. Heather's smile grew more rehearsed. This hotel tends to book up far in advance, especially for our more exclusive clientele. The message was clear. You don't look like you belong here. Sandra inhaled slowly. Her pulse remained calm, though she could feel the cold of her damp sleeves settling into her skin. She wasn't angry yet, just tired, bone-tired from years of being overlooked the moment she dressed down or chose to walk in quietly. "I'd appreciate it if you could double-check," she said. "Maybe under the middle name." Heather pursed her lips. "And what was that?" "Bonnet." Heather gave a thin smile and repeated it under her breath while typing with exaggerated slowness. The keys clicked without purpose. Her eyes darted toward Sandra's duffel bag again, then back to the screen. "I still don't see anything," she announced. "And if you didn't receive a second confirmation, it's possible the reservation was never finalized." "I did," Sandra replied. "It's in that same email. Scroll down." Heather took the phone reluctantly, but rather than reading the message, she let out a breath through her nose, the kind meant to signal inconvenience. "Well, perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of our sister hotels. I can recommend a more affordable option just a few blocks away. Very clean, friendly staff." Sandra stood quietly. The lobby had grown more aware of the interaction. A man seated near the fireplace paused his conversation. A woman at the bar leaned slightly in their direction, but Heather didn't seem to care. Or maybe she enjoyed the growing tension. "There's no need for another hotel," Sandra replied evenly. "I booked here, with full payment. I have the receipt." Heather gave a condescending nod. "Yes, of course. If you'd like to step aside while I attempt to reach a supervisor, I'm sure we can get it sorted eventually." The emphasis on eventually was deliberate. Sandra said nothing. She simply took back her phone and stared at Heather, her expression neutral. But inside, a storm was beginning to rise. Heather turned away from the counter, whispering something to a colleague before disappearing through a side door. Sandra remained at the front desk, standing in the same spot, her hand still holding her phone. The confirmation email glowed on the screen. She didn't bother to sit or move to the lounge. She had nothing to hide, and she wasn't going to shrink herself just to make someone else feel comfortable. Across the lobby, murmurs began to ripple. The man at the bar whispered to the woman beside him. The couple by the fireplace looked up again, curiosity in their eyes. A staff member wheeling a cart slowed near the elevators. Something was happening, even if no one quite knew what it was yet. Heather returned minutes later, her expression unchanged. She didn't mention speaking to a supervisor, nor did she offer any new explanation. "Our system hasn't updated, and unfortunately without an active reservation, we can't provide access to a room," she said crisply. "We prioritize guest security." Sandra kept her eyes on Heather's face. "I'm not asking for special treatment, just what I've already paid for." Heather smiled, a tight, insincere expression. "I understand. It's just policy." "Policy?" Sandra echoed, her voice still calm, but now edged with something sharper. "Your system didn't even load the reservation page. I saw the screen." Heather blinked. A flicker of surprise passed over her face. She hadn't expected Sandra to notice. "You didn't even try," Sandra continued. "You assumed something, and that assumption is the problem." Heather looked momentarily flustered, then she regrouped. "If you'd like to wait in the lounge, I'll see if the manager can expedite this." Sandra stared at her a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Fine." She stepped away from the desk, but she didn't move far, just enough to give Heather space while still remaining visible. She sat on a small velvet bench near the check-in line, placed her duffel bag on the floor beside her, and crossed her legs. The scent of lavender no longer felt soothing, it felt staged. Heather returned to the computer, now aware that the lobby was paying attention. Her shoulders stiffened, her typing suddenly purposeful, but the damage was already done. At the bar, the man who had been observing discreetly lifted his phone, pretended to check messages, and quickly snapped a photo of Sandra from the side. His brows furrowed as he looked closer at the image. Recognition dawned. A celebrity sitting unnoticed, at least by some. A whisper floated across the lounge. Isn't that Sandra Bullock? Someone else leaned in. No way! Back at the front desk, Heather's eyes met Sandra's for the first time in several minutes. This time, her gaze faltered. Because now, she wasn't just looking at a woman in a hoodie. She was realizing too late that she'd made a very public mistake. And Sandra wasn't alone. Somewhere outside those tall revolving doors, someone else was about to arrive. And that someone would change everything. Heather stood behind the reception desk, now fully aware that she was being watched. But that awareness didn't lead to humility. Instead, it made her double down. She began typing again, slowly this time, her fingers drifting over the keys without urgency. Her face was the picture of bored professionalism, but there was a sharp edge to it. Every movement was deliberate. Every pause had a silent message. Sandra sat nearby, watching quietly, arms folded over her chest. She wasn't one to cause a scene. But this wasn't about just a booking anymore. It was about dignity. Heather sighed and leaned back slightly, turning toward a nearby colleague under the guise of asking for assistance. "Did the system update recently?" she asked, in a voice loud enough to be heard across the counter. The other receptionist glanced at her, slightly confused. "Not that I know of." Heather smiled vaguely and turned back to the screen. She leaned closer, as if scanning deeply through files. Sandra kept her gaze steady. She had traveled the world. She had met presidents, served causes, and spent nights on red carpets and humanitarian sites alike. But nothing quite prepared you for the small humiliations that people like Heather delivered behind expensive counters. After another long pause, Heather finally looked up, expression carefully blank. "I think I see something, but it's not marked as a VIP booking," she said. Sandra raised an eyebrow. "It doesn't need to be VIP. It's just a confirmed reservation." Heather tilted her head. "Of course. I'm only pointing out that the Bellcourt's premium rooms usually carry a specific tag. Yours seems more standard." Her voice lingered a half-second too long on that final word. Sandra didn't flinch. "I reserved a one-bedroom suite, that's all." Heather nodded and smiled, but her eyes betrayed her. She tapped a few more keys and then let out a dramatic sigh. "I'm so sorry, Miss Annette," she said, drawing out the last name as if testing its authenticity. "The system's still syncing. Sometimes we have these issues when bookings are made through third-party platforms." "I booked directly through your hotel website," Sandra replied. Heather blinked, then gave a nonchalant shrug. "Well, the interface can still be inconsistent. Technology, right?" Sandra lifted her phone and turned it toward her once more. "Would you like to see the payment receipt again?" Heather hesitated just a second too long. Then she waved a hand. No, I believe you. I'm just not seeing it reflected here. We'll have to wait for the system to resolve." Sandra said nothing. Her stillness was more powerful than anything she could have said. Heather tapped her manicured nails against the desk and leaned forward. "In the meantime, you're more than welcome to wait in the side lounge. There's complimentary water and tea service. We'll call you when it shows up." Sandra didn't move, and she didn't blink. Not yet. Because the insult had been delivered without any raised voice or obvious slur. But it had landed all the same. Sandra stood up slowly, but instead of heading to the lounge as suggested, she walked calmly back to the counter and placed her phone flat on the desk between them. Her voice remained level, but there was an unmistakable firmness beneath it. "This is the confirmation email from your hotel. It includes the booking ID, my full name, the room type, and the payment receipt. You can verify it against your database manually." Heather looked down at the phone, her eyes flicking over the screen, but her expression didn't change. She didn't reach for it. She didn't move to compare the details. Instead, she leaned back and let out another long sigh. "Yes, I understand that you have a confirmation email," she said with forced patience, "but, as I mentioned, the system is syncing, and if the reservation hasn't come through on our end, There's nothing I can do at this moment." Sandra tilted her head. "Are you saying the confirmation from your own hotel means nothing if your software is lagging?" Heather smiled thinly. "I'm saying we follow procedures, and until that reservation appears, there's nothing I can authorize." Sandra could feel the air in the room thickening. A few guests now watched openly. The man at the bar had turned his stool slightly. A woman in a long green coat whispered something to her partner. Eyes were on them, but Heather seemed unfazed. "I'm not asking you to authorize anything out of protocol," Sandra replied quietly. "I'm asking you to follow through on a booking that was already completed. Your own site processed it." Heather's tone shifted ever so slightly. There was something theatrical in her next response, something designed to place Sandra in a lesser position. "I understand you might be frustrated, Miss Annette, but again, without the reservation in our system, I can't hand over a room key. You wouldn't want us handing out rooms without verification, would you, especially in a place like this?" "A place like this?" Sandra repeated. Heather's smile returned. "The Bellcourt is known for being selective. Our clientele expect a certain standard." Sandra gave the slightest nod, her eyes unreadable now. "And what is it about me that doesn't meet that standard?" Heather paused. She hadn't expected that question. She fumbled briefly, then gave a vague response. "I didn't say that. I'm only referring to the procedures." "But the guest in front of me is holding a paid confirmation and ID," Sandra continued. "And your system still hasn't been accessed fully. You're just choosing not to process it." "I'm prioritizing verified check-ins," Heather said quickly. "We're quite busy tonight." Sandra looked around. There was no one else at the desk. The check-in line was empty. The lounge was half full but quiet. "I see," she replied. "Busy indeed." Heather blinked rapidly but didn't answer. The exchange, subtle as it was, had drawn a clear line, and Sandra, for all her restraint, wasn't stepping back. Heather straightened her blazer, then reached beneath the counter and retrieved a brochure. She slid it across the desk with a practiced motion. "If you'd prefer not to wait, here's a list of nearby accommodations we often recommend to walk-ins. Very comfortable, a bit more casual, and generally easier to process without the usual verification issues." Sandra looked down at the brochure but didn't touch it. She didn't need to. The message was clear. She was being told to leave. Not directly, not rudely, but with enough precision that it couldn't be mistaken for anything else. A few feet away, the man at the bar raised his phone again and took another picture. This time, he didn't try to hide it. From across the lobby, someone whispered, "That really is her." Sandra didn't turn. She kept her eyes on Heather. "You're suggesting I go somewhere else," she said slowly, "even after I've shown payment and confirmation." Heather smiled. "Just trying to be helpful, Miss Annette. You seem tired. I thought maybe something more low-key might suit your needs tonight." The final word hit like a slap. Sandra inhaled, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to collect herself. She nodded slowly and reached for her phone, lifting it off the desk and placing it back into her coat pocket. "Tell me something," she asked quietly, almost conversationally. "If I had walked in wearing a Chanel coat and diamond earrings, would you have responded the same way?" Heather blinked. I treat all guests equally." Sandra gave a faint smile. "No, you treat all guests based on what you think they're worth." There was a pause. Heather's eyes darted toward her co-worker, then back to Sandra. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. Sandra turned without another word and walked toward the lounge seating area. She passed the man at the bar, who nodded at her with a mixture of sympathy and recognition. As she sat down again on the velvet bench, her expression was unreadable, but her silence carried weight. Heather returned to her screen, her fingers finally tapping faster, but it was too late. Guests had seen. Whispers were spreading. The tension had thickened, not disappeared. A young hotel attendant stepped out from a hallway and walked toward Heather, who leaned over the desk and whispered quickly, clearly trying to brush off the growing attention. But her voice was tight now, nervous. Sandra sat in the corner with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. She didn't need to fight. She didn't need to shout, because something was about to happen, something she didn't orchestrate, something she hadn't even asked for, and it would shift the entire power dynamic of the room. Because at that very moment, outside those towering glass doors, Keanu Reeves was stepping out of a black sedan and into the rain. And when he walked through that door, everything Heather thought she understood about status, worth, and presence would begin to collapse. The velvet cushion beneath Sandra barely gave as she sat in the far corner of the lounge. The chair was positioned near a tall ficus plant, partially shielding her from the main line of sight. But it didn't shield her from what she already knew was happening behind the front desk. She kept her back straight, her legs crossed, her hands still folded in her lap. The duffel bag remained at her feet, quiet and plain, like everything else about her appearance that night. The soft clink of glassware came from the bar nearby. A few guests were talking, but the low hum of conversation couldn't drown out the new rhythm of the room, one of watching, pausing, and pretending not to notice what had just unfolded. A middle-aged couple sitting nearby had already stopped their conversation. The woman had glanced at Sandra once, then twice, then leaned in toward her husband. They spoke in low tones, but Sandra didn't need to hear the words. She could feel the shift. Heather stood behind the reception desk again, her fingers tapping against the counter now without typing. She leaned toward the receptionist beside her, Kara, judging by her badge, and whispered something while darting a glance toward the lounge. Kara's eyes followed the signal. When she spotted Sandra, her brow furrowed and her mouth opened slightly before she quickly looked away. Heather's whisper continued, hushed but energetic. Kara nodded once and returned to her computer, but the energy between them was unmistakable. Heather still didn't know, but Kara might have started to. The man at the bar, mid-30s, smart casual attire, holding a bourbon glass, had his phone out again. He tilted it downward, pretending to check a message, then angled it just slightly. The shutter sound was silent, but Sandra saw the movement. The corner of her mouth twitched, not in anger but in weary understanding. The first photo had been curiosity, the second was certainty. Sandra leaned back, adjusting the hood of her sweatshirt. She didn't want to be recognized, not like this. She had chosen to come alone, without an assistant, without makeup, without anything to announce her. But there was always someone watching, always someone who pieced it together. She picked up her phone again and unlocked it. Her thumb hovered briefly over the message app before she tapped the top pinned contact. She typed with a calm precision, "Here, lobby." Quiet storm brewing. She paused, then hit send. The screen lit up with a single word in response. 1 minute later. "On my way." Sandra exhaled and set the phone beside her on the velvet armrest. Her fingers interlocked again in her lap. She stared ahead at the centerpiece flower arrangement. White orchids, impossibly elegant but somehow artificial looking in the sterile light of the lounge. Her silence continued, but the tension was no longer just hers to carry. The room was holding its breath now, and the longer Heather stood confidently unaware, the deeper the fall would be. From where she sat, Sandra could see Heather still talking to Kara in hushed tones, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, gesturing now and then with one hand as if explaining something she believed she had under control. But it wasn't under control. Not anymore. Kara's expression had changed. She looked troubled, unsure. Her fingers hovered above her keyboard, frozen in indecision. Sandra knew that look. It was the expression of someone slowly realizing that something wasn't right, but not yet brave enough to challenge it. The couple nearby continued to glance in Sandra's direction. The woman, dressed in a gray wool coat and boots with silver buckles, finally leaned closer to her husband. "I think it's her," she whispered. "Who?" the man asked, half paying attention. She lowered her voice even further. "Sandra Bullock." He gave her a look of doubt. "Here? Dressed like that?" "That's exactly why it's her," the woman replied. "She's trying not to be noticed." The man looked again, longer this time. "You're right. That's definitely her." More heads turned. Conversations quieted slightly. The awareness was spreading like ripples in a still lake. Sandra didn't meet their eyes. She didn't need to. She kept her posture composed, her focus forward, but she noticed the shift in energy. It always came at the same moment, when strangers started recognizing her not from her clothes or her voice, but from the quiet confidence she carried when she wasn't trying to be anyone other than herself. Back at the reception desk, Heather was still unaware of just how visible her arrogance had become. She was flipping through a laminated guest services folder now, trying to look busy, still holding on to the illusion of control. Kara, meanwhile, had discreetly pulled out her phone. Her fingers tapped quickly. She showed the screen to Heather under the counter. Heather leaned in, squinting at the phone. Her brows drew together. Sandra knew what was happening. Someone had already posted the photo. Someone had already captioned it. It was beginning. The man at the bar turned to speak quietly to the bartender, who glanced briefly toward Sandra, then gave a slow nod. He whispered something back, then quickly walked toward the staff hallway. Everything was shifting now. The temperature in the room hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. Guests who had barely noticed Sandra 10 minutes ago were now holding their phones, scrolling, whispering. But Heather was still trying to preserve her illusion. She lifted her chin and walked away from Kara, approaching the desk alone again, projecting confidence. She looked toward the lounge, her eyes landing on Sandra with an expression that was no longer smug, but uncertain. She knew something was coming, but she had no idea how close it already was. Heather adjusted her blazer and cleared her throat. She walked around the front desk as if to assert her control again, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble. But as she glanced at Sandra once more, the certainty in her expression began to slip. It was the eyes. Something in the way Sandra held her gaze, quiet, unwavering, without fear, made Heather falter. She hesitated, then took a few slow steps toward the lounge, stopping just shy of the velvet seating area. Her voice was pleasant, too pleasant as she spoke. "Ms. Annette, we're still experiencing a delay. I appreciate your patience. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable waiting in the business center just down the hall. It's a bit more private." Sandra didn't move. Her voice, when it came, was soft but firm. "I'm fine right here." Heather's jaw tightened slightly. "Of course. Just trying to accommodate." Sandra held her gaze for one more second, then looked away, as if the conversation wasn't worth her time. Heather stood awkwardly in place for another moment before turning and heading back to her station. As she walked away, someone near the bar muttered under their breath, "She's going to regret that." Heather returned to the desk and opened the hotel's internal system again, finally beginning to type with real urgency. She flipped from one tab to another, her brow furrowing, her eyes darting across the screen. She was starting to realize what Kara had already seen. There was a reservation, and it had been there the entire time. She clicked quickly through screens, then opened the guest list for the night. Sandra Annette Bullock. 1-bedroom suite. Prepaid. No issues on the account. Heather's mouth went dry. Her reflection in the monitor showed her own expression collapsing. Behind her, Kara leaned in and whispered, "Did you see who she is?" Heather didn't answer. She didn't need to. Across the lobby, the doorman straightened and touched his earpiece. The large front doors to the hotel opened with a hiss. A gust of wind swept through the space, carrying with it the sound of light rain and the low hum of the city outside. Guests turned, conversations halted, and then he walked in. Keanu Reeves. Wearing a tailored black coat, collar slightly turned up, dark jeans, and boots still wet from the storm. His hair was damp, his stride calm, composed. His presence shifted everything. Like a stone dropped into water, ripples of recognition spread instantly. The doorman gave a respectful nod. The bartender froze mid-pour. Heather turned slowly and saw him. Her heart stopped. He was already scanning the room. His eyes found Sandra without delay, and when they did, his face changed. A quiet warmth entered his expression. Something familiar. Something fiercely protective. He walked straight toward her. The crowd parted silently, unknowingly, and Heather, standing at the desk, suddenly understood. Her night was about to unravel in a way she could never have imagined. The massive glass doors of the Bellcourt Hotel swept open with a low hiss, ushered in by the silent hand of the doorman. The cold air from outside rushed into the warm lobby, carrying with it the scent of wet pavement and the faint, distant sound of traffic. Every head turned. It was instinctual. Even the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to hush. Keanu Reeves stepped inside. He wore a long black coat, rain-speckled and heavy with purpose. His dark hair was damp, slicked back from his face, the moisture still fresh from the walk across the pavement. His boots, slightly muddied at the sole, tracked a small line of rainwater as he moved across the marble floor. He paused only once, just beyond the threshold, letting the door close quietly behind him. The atmosphere shifted. The bartender froze with a glass in his hand. A bellhop stood still in mid-step. At the front desk, Heather's fingers hovered above her keyboard, her eyes locked onto him, widening slightly, her breath catching in her throat. He didn't look around for long. His eyes moved calmly across the room, from the crackling fireplace to the bar, then to the seating area near the velvet bench in the corner. And when he saw her, his entire expression softened. Keanu walked forward with steady, measured steps. His shoulders were relaxed, but there was unmistakable energy in the way he moved, direct, intentional, and utterly calm. He didn't need to raise his voice or draw attention. The room was already watching. Sandra looked up from her seat just as he reached her. Her eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them. She gave the smallest nod, and he returned it with a soft curve of his lips, barely a smile, but warm enough to speak volumes. He turned slightly, now facing the front desk. And then, finally, his gaze landed on Heather. She stood frozen. Her posture stiffened under his gaze. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words emerged. It was as if the marble floor beneath her had shifted without warning. Keanu didn't raise an eyebrow. He didn't scowl. His expression was calm, neutral, but focused. He spoke with a low, even voice that carried easily through the silence. "Everything okay here?" Those 4 words sliced through the tension in the room. Not harsh, not accusatory, but undeniable. Heather swallowed. Her mouth twitched as if trying to form a smile, but it didn't come. Kara, standing a few feet behind her, looked down quickly at her shoes, pretending to be focused on something on her monitor. The energy had changed, and everyone could feel it. Something had been exposed, even before a single name had been spoken. Sandra remained seated, her hands still folded neatly in her lap. She didn't answer his question. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew that something was very, very wrong. Heather's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked back at Keanu like she was staring at a ghost, or worse, a mirror reflecting everything she had just done. Her face, once composed and polished, had begun to lose its color. The calm confidence that had carried her through the previous 30 minutes now dissolved into a rigid panic beneath the surface of her expression. Keanu tilted his head slightly as if encouraging an answer, his tone still even, quiet. "I asked if everything's okay." Heather forced a breath. "Yes, sir, just a minor system delay. We're handling it." Keanu looked past her, toward the desk and the glowing screen. The reservation system now clearly displayed a name in bold letters. Sandra Annette Bullock. He saw it, so did everyone else within view of the monitor. Sandra stood now, slowly and with grace, stepping beside Keanu but not behind him. Her presence at his side wasn't a need for defense, it was quiet alignment. She glanced once toward the desk but said nothing. Her silence, dignified and steady, spoke louder than anything she might have shouted earlier. Keanu turned back to Heather, his voice gentle but firm. Because from what I saw when I walked in, it didn't look like things were being handled. Heather stumbled for words, her voice thin. I was following protocol, sir. The reservation didn't appear in the system until just now. That's strange, Keanu said, because the confirmation was sent days ago, with payment verified. Sandra showed it to you, didn't she? Heather nodded once, a jerky motion. Yes, but there was a syncing issue. Kara glanced up from behind the desk, her face slightly pink. She didn't speak, but her eyes met Keanu's for half a second, apologetic. Then she looked down again. Sandra finally spoke, and her voice was as calm as ever. She suggested I find a more affordable hotel, something easier to process without verification issues. A ripple went through the lobby, a low murmur. Someone near the fireplace dropped a fork on a ceramic plate. At the bar, the man who had taken the photo looked up and simply whispered, "No way." Keanu's gaze didn't leave Heather's face. "Did you say that?" Heather's voice was barely audible. "It wasn't meant that way." "But that's what you said." Heather didn't answer. Keanu stepped slightly closer to the desk. Not threatening, just grounded, solid. "In a place like this," he said, "you'd think people would be trained to treat every guest with respect, whether you recognize their face or not." Heather's eyes dropped to the desk. Her fingers clenched tightly together, as if holding on to whatever pride she had left. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with heat, with scrutiny, with the quiet realization that something irreversible had happened, and that the man standing calmly in front of her wasn't just a guest. He was the tipping point. Heather stood frozen, her face pale as her carefully constructed sense of control began to fracture in real time. Her shoulders stiffened, and her eyes darted to Kara, as if hoping for support, a lifeline, a way out. But Kara was already pretending to be busy, scrolling through windows on her screen that no longer held any relevance. Everyone was pretending now, except for the guests who had witnessed everything and were no longer hiding their curiosity. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet presence filled the room more powerfully than any shouted confrontation could. He turned slightly toward Sandra, his tone softening with something only a true friend could offer. "You okay?" Sandra gave the smallest nod. "I'm fine, just tired." Heather took a half step forward. "Mr. Reeves, I assure you this was just a misunderstanding. Our system was acting up, and the confirmation didn't show up until a few minutes ago." Keanu's eyes locked on hers again. "You had the confirmation in your hand." Heather swallowed. "Yes, but..." "You had the ID, the email, the name. You just chose not to believe her." There was no aggression in his voice, just truth. And truth, spoken plainly, has a way of stripping away every excuse someone might reach for. Heather opened her mouth again but stopped. There was nothing left to defend. Her usual tone, poised, dismissive, laced with control, was gone. Now she was just a young woman standing behind a desk, exposed for the way she had treated someone based on appearance alone. Behind them, the security guard by the door shifted his weight. The couple by the fireplace stared openly now. The man at the bar had his phone in hand again, but didn't take another photo. He didn't need to. What was happening was already seared into everyone's memory. Kara finally stood and stepped to the side, carefully pulling out 2 room key cards. She extended them toward Sandra with both hands, eyes cast down. "I located the reservation, Suite 1403. It's ready for you now, Ms. Bullock. I apologize for the delay." Sandra didn't move to take the keys. Heather, realizing Kara was stepping in, quickly reached for them instead. "I'll handle it," she said quickly, trying to reclaim her role. But Keanu gently held up a hand. "No. You've done enough." Heather froze. That single sentence, quiet and calm, hit harder than a reprimand ever could. Her arm dropped to her side. Sandra stepped forward, took the keys from Kara, and gave a small nod. No smile. No acknowledgement to Heather. Just quiet resolve. Keanu turned back to Heather one last time. "Next time," he said, "believe the guest, not your assumptions." Then he picked up Sandra's duffel bag and turned toward the elevators. They walked together in silence. And behind them, Heather stood alone, her ears burning with the realization that every whisper, every glance, every murmur in that lobby was about her. And none of it would be forgotten. Keanu stood beside Sandra, close enough that the gesture didn't feel performative. It felt personal, deliberate. His presence at her side made the message impossible to ignore. The moment was quiet, but every person in the lobby felt the shift. Guests who had watched in polite silence were now alert, wide-eyed, leaning slightly forward in their seats or lowering their voices mid-conversation. The woman at the fireplace gripped her wine glass with both hands. The man at the bar set his phone down slowly. Heather took a shaky breath. Her face had lost its confident glow. She glanced toward Kara, but her coworker was now staying carefully focused on her screen, as if distance might save her from being part of what was unraveling. Keanu rested one hand gently on Sandra's shoulder. The way he did it wasn't dramatic or forced. It was calm, steady, like he was anchoring her, not to defend her, but to remind the room she didn't stand alone. He looked at Heather with a kind of focused patience that could shatter walls. "You didn't recognize her?" he asked, the tone not accusing but impossibly clear. Heather blinked fast. I didn't know who she was, She didn't say her full name. "Ian gave you the reservation?" Keanu said. "The name was on the confirmation." Heather opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. Someone near the bar let out a soft gasp. A teenage girl, wearing a dark blue hoodie, whispered loudly to her mother. "That's Sandra Bullock." The whisper wasn't contained. It traveled. Another guest turned and whispered to his partner. "Oh my God, that's really her?" Within seconds, the ripple had moved through the entire lounge. A hush fell over the room, not of silence, but recognition. And as it settled, the weight of it hit Heather like a wave. Her mouth twitched, trying to form words that might walk her back from the edge, but there was nowhere left to step. Sandra said nothing. She didn't nod. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. Keanu's hand remained steady on her shoulder, as if to say, "You've said enough. Let them realize it themselves." Heather fumbled now, her fingers finally typing into the system with real urgency. The screen glowed with reservation records. She clicked, scrolled, then froze. Her voice came out like a whisper, cracking. "Found it." She stared at the entry for a beat too long, then clicked again to open the full details. She swallowed visibly. The reservation had been processed 2 weeks prior, paid in full. 1-bedroom suite. Sandra Annette Bullock. VIP preference flagged. Nothing was missing. Nothing had ever been missing. Heather glanced up, eyes darting nervously between Keanu and Sandra. It must be a syncing error," she said. "Sometimes the interface doesn't update immediately." No one believed it. Not the guests. Not Kara. Not even Heather herself. Heather's fingers trembled as she tried to force a professional smile onto her face, but the muscles wouldn't cooperate. Her voice wavered as she pressed on. I sincerely apologize, Ms. Bullock. It appears your reservation is in fact fully confirmed, room 1403. It must have gotten stuck in the internal queue." Keanu didn't move. He didn't blink. He just looked at her. Sandra still hadn't said a word. Heather extended a hand toward Kara, her voice slightly sharper than before. "Kara, can you please print out the guests' key cards?" Kara nodded quickly and began typing, but her posture spoke volumes. Rigid, defensive, trying not to be included in the fallout that now felt inevitable. The tension was so thick it clung to every corner of the lobby. Even the fireplace crackle seemed quieter. From the far side of the lounge, the teenage girl whispered again. She tried to kick out Sandra Bullock? Her mother gave her a subtle tap on the arm, trying to hush her, but the words had already landed. The man at the bar leaned in, shaking his head slowly. "Did you hear what she said to her before Reeves showed up?" he asked the bartender, who gave a low grunt of acknowledgement. "Told her to go to a cheaper place?" Another couple nearby exchanged glances. "She's going to be all over the news tomorrow," the man muttered. And Heather heard every word. Not clearly, not loudly, but with enough clarity to feel them sink into her skin. The lobby wasn't just filled with whispers, it was filled with judgment. Not against the woman she had tried to dismiss, but against her. Kara handed over the printed key cards, still warm from the machine. Heather took them, but her hand trembled slightly. She forced herself to extend them across the counter toward Sandra. "Again, I apologize for the confusion. Please accept our compliments. A bottle of wine will be sent to your room." Sandra looked at the key cards but didn't reach for them. She looked at Heather, not with anger, not with pity, with the same calm strength she'd shown since the moment she walked through the doors. "I didn't ask for a bottle of wine." Heather froze. "I asked to be treated like a guest." The words, though quiet, landed like thunder. Sandra reached forward and took the key cards from her hand without another glance. Then she stepped back beside Keanu. Keanu tilted his head slightly, giving Heather one final look, not cruel, not smug, but firm. "She showed you everything you needed," he said, "and you still decided she wasn't worth the effort." Heather's jaw clenched. He turned to Sandra, his voice softening again. "Ready?" Sandra nodded once. "Very." They turned toward the elevators, and behind them, a silence heavier than before settled over the lobby, not out of confusion, but realization. Everyone knew what had just happened, and no one would forget it. Heather stood still, her arm slowly lowering as Sandra and Keanu walked away. She was no longer the gatekeeper of the Bellcourt's elegance. She was now the cautionary tale at the center of every stare. Her ears burned with the weight of judgment. No one was defending her. No one was whispering in her favor. Even Kara had quietly stepped aside, putting distance between herself and the wreckage unfolding behind the marble desk. At the fireplace, the woman in the gray coat leaned toward her husband. She held her ground without raising her voice, she said. "That's real class." He nodded slowly. "And Keanu? Didn't even need to yell, just showed up and leveled the whole room." They both looked toward the elevators where Sandra and Keanu now waited. A soft chime announced the car's arrival. The gold doors opened and the two of them stepped inside. Sandra held her head high, the key cards in her hand, her duffel slung over her shoulder. Keanu stood beside her, his presence quiet but grounding. As the elevator doors closed, Keanu's hand gently brushed Sandra's back, a small gesture of solidarity. No spotlight, no speeches, just the quiet reassurance that someone had seen what happened and refused to let it stand. Back at the front desk, Heather stared blankly at the empty space where they had stood. Her fingers still hovered near the keyboard, but she no longer knew what to type. Kara, trying to break the tension, softly offered, "Do you want me to reset the next check-in?" Heather didn't answer. She couldn't. She just nodded vaguely, staring down at the monitor as if it might somehow save her. But there was no system error this time, no glitch. Just a choice she had made in front of a lobby full of people. A choice that now had a face, a name, and witnesses. The teenage girl who had spoken earlier was now scrolling through her phone excitedly. "It's already online," she whispered to her mother. "Someone posted a video of it. He walked in like a movie scene." Her mother looked around nervously. "Put your phone away." But everyone's sharing it. And she was right. The story had already started moving beyond the walls of the Bellcourt. The photo from earlier, the whispers, the silent phone recordings. It was all spreading. The receptionist who humiliated Sandra Bullock, the man who stood beside her and turned the moment into something unforgettable. In the center of it all, Heather stood alone, surrounded by chandeliers and polished marble, but stripped of the control she once wielded. She slowly turned and walked to the back office, shoulders tight, trying to escape the eyes that followed her. But it was too late. The realization had landed. She hadn't just mistreated a guest, she'd underestimated a woman. And that mistake would follow her far longer than the length of any reservation. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his posture dramatically or point fingers. He simply leaned forward, placing one hand lightly on the reception desk. His tone was calm, but the silence around him made every syllable ring louder than anything shouted. "Would this system error have happened," he asked slowly, "if she walked in here wearing diamonds?" Heather's breath caught. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mouth opened slightly, but the weight of the question filled the room. Every guest now seemed to lean closer, not physically but emotionally, drawn into the stillness, held in place by the tension that had no place to escape. Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "Would you have checked the system? Twice? 3 times? Would you have rushed to offer her a sweet, a complimentary drink? Anything that suggested she belonged?" Heather swallowed hard, but still said nothing. Keanu nodded slightly to himself, as if confirming what he already knew. "What if she wasn't Sandra Bullock?" he continued, quieter now. "What if she were a teacher, or a nurse, or just someone exhausted from a long day? Someone without a manager or a publicist? Someone who just needed a warm place to sleep?" He paused, letting the question land. "Would you have helped her?" The silence deepened. Heather's voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. I didn't mean for it to come off that way." Keanu tilted his head slightly, but it did. Heather looked down. Her hands trembled at her sides. "It wasn't personal," she whispered. Keanu didn't flinch. "That's the problem." Across the room, no one moved. A man in a charcoal suit near the bar had stopped mid-sip. The teenage girl near the fireplace held her phone in her lap, no longer recording, just watching. Even the music seemed to fade, replaced by the steady, subtle breathing of people who suddenly understood they were witnessing something bigger than a booking error. Heather's face had lost all color. Her chin trembled ever so slightly. She looked toward the side hallway, as if silently begging for someone to appear and rescue her from the spotlight she had so confidently stepped into only minutes ago. And then, as if on cue, he arrived. The hotel manager, Mr. Franklin, hurried into the lobby, his phone still in hand, his face pale and tight. His eyes darted to the monitor behind the desk, then to Heather, then to the guests. He had seen enough. He didn't speak right away. He scanned the room with the look of someone who had just read the headline before stepping into the story itself. Then his eyes met Keanu's, and in that single look, everything became clear. Mr. Franklin's voice was low but direct. "Mr. Reeves, Ms. Bullock, I just reviewed the footage." Heather closed her eyes. Her shoulders began to shake, but the moment for pity had passed. Now it was time for truth. Mr. Franklin stepped forward, placing his phone face down on the marble counter with deliberate care. The sound it made was soft but final. He turned his attention toward Heather, his voice controlled but laced with quiet disappointment. "I watched every second, Heather." Heather didn't look up. Her lips parted like she might respond, but no words followed. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk as if it were the only thing keeping her standing. "You had her ID, you had the confirmation email, you saw her name clearly. And instead of doing your job, you chose to judge her." Heather finally lifted her gaze, eyes glossy, voice weak. "I thought—" "No," the manager cut in, gently but firmly. "You didn't think. You assumed." He turned now to Keanu and Sandra, his expression filled with genuine regret. "I want to sincerely apologize on behalf of the Bellcourt Hotel. What happened here tonight is not who we claim to be. It was unprofessional, unacceptable, and completely inexcusable." Sandra didn't speak. She simply gave a single, quiet nod. Keanu, standing tall beside her, asked one more question, his tone just as calm as before. "If I hadn't walked in, would she still be sitting in that lounge, waiting for help that was never coming?" Mr. Franklin exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but I do," Keanu said. "She would have been dismissed, sent away, told she didn't belong." Heather's shoulders trembled. She tried to find a place to look that wasn't filled with shame, but every corner of the lobby now held witnesses. Every hallway seemed lit by the echoes of her mistake. "I didn't mean to humiliate her," she whispered. Sandra finally turned her head, her voice quiet but strong. "You didn't need to mean it, you just did it." Mr. Franklin shifted his weight, clearly struggling with how to move forward. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Bullock," he said carefully, "your suite is being personally prepared as we speak. I've instructed the staff to ensure your stay is flawless for the duration of your visit, and of course, tonight's stay will be entirely complimentary." Keanu didn't respond right away. He looked toward Sandra, giving her the choice. She spoke with grace, not anger. "We're not asking for freebies, just fairness." The manager nodded, swallowing back the tension in his throat. "Of course." Heather remained behind the desk, silent now, barely breathing. Her once polished posture had wilted under the pressure of the truth being spoken out loud. The guests in the lounge didn't need to say anything. Their silence was the loudest judgment of all. Mr. Franklin looked once more at Heather and said quietly, "We'll speak privately after this." Heather nodded slowly, her face pale, her eyes locked to the floor. But even before that conversation came, she already knew what was waiting for her. And it was no longer just a system error. It was accountability. Mr. Franklin turned back toward the guests with a composed but deeply troubled expression. "To everyone in the lobby, I also like to apologize for what you witnessed tonight. Our promise is to treat every guest with dignity, without exception. That promise was broken this evening, and we will address it internally without delay." A soft murmur spread through the lounge. It wasn't anger. It was understanding. People weren't outraged by Sandra's fame. They were moved by how easily things could have gone differently if not for timing, if not for someone like Keanu walking in. The woman by the fireplace whispered to her husband, "He didn't humiliate her. He just told the truth." Heather remained behind the desk, shrinking under the weight of it all. Her carefully styled appearance now seemed like a costume, no longer a shield. She had built a wall between herself and the people she served, and tonight that wall had crumbled in front of everyone. Keanu looked at Mr. Franklin, then gently nodded. "We're not here to make a scene," he said, "but I hope this becomes a moment that changes something. Because what you just saw, it doesn't only happen to people with cameras around." Mr. Franklin nodded solemnly. "You're right. It's not just about celebrity. It's about basic decency." Sandra turned then and met Heather's eyes. For the first time, there was something more than quiet strength in her gaze. There was a glimmer of sadness. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" she asked. Heather didn't answer. Sandra continued softly. "It wasn't being ignored. It was knowing you decided who I was before I said a single word." The words struck something deeper than anything else. Heather's face crumpled for a brief second. She looked like she might cry, but not for sympathy, for realization. Keanu placed a gentle hand on Sandra's back again, then turned to Mr. Franklin. "We'll go up now." Mr. Franklin stepped aside immediately. "If you need anything at all, anything, we'll be ready." Keanu nodded, and together they walked toward the elevators. This time, the crowd didn't just stare. They silently moved aside with a kind of quiet reverence. The bellhop by the elevators pressed the button without being asked. As they stepped inside, Sandra paused for a moment, looking back across the lobby. Then she turned forward again. The elevator doors closed. And in that lingering silence, Heather remained still, her reflection in the black glass of the computer screen showing a very different woman than the one who had begun her shift. Whatever came next would not be about reputation. It would be about reckoning, and everyone in that lobby, including her, knew it. Mr. Franklin stepped back toward the counter, his shoulders square, his hands clasped in front of him. Though he had regained some composure, the weight of the moment hadn't left him. The murmurs throughout the lounge had softened, but hadn't disappeared. Everyone was still watching. Every eye was on Sandra Bullock, Keanu Reeves, and the man now trying to clean up the damage done by one of his own staff members. He looked directly at Sandra as he spoke. "Ms. Bullock, on behalf of the Bellcourt, please allow me to offer our sincerest apologies. What happened tonight should never have happened. It's unacceptable and beneath the standards we claim to uphold." Sandra looked at him, her expression neutral but deeply present. "We'll be upgrading your suite immediately," Mr. Franklin continued, his voice low but clear. "Full penthouse access, complimentary dining service for the remainder of your stay, and of course, all charges have already been waived. We hope to provide an experience that reflects what our hotel should stand for." There was a pause, a space where he clearly hoped to end on a conciliatory note. Sandra looked down briefly, then back up, her voice soft but unshakable. "It's not about the room." Mr. Franklin froze. She continued gently, "It's about how people are treated." He nodded once, slowly. The moment landed with more weight than anything else that had been said since he arrived. Sandra didn't speak with anger or demand. She wasn't using her voice to elevate herself. She was using it to remind him and everyone else of something they had forgotten. That dignity wasn't a reward for status. It was the baseline. Mr. Franklin looked visibly moved. Then he turned toward Heather, who had taken a single step back from the desk and now stood with her hands loosely clasped in front of her. Her posture, once proud and unbothered, was now slumped and tense. "I'd like to speak with you privately," he said. Heather looked up at him, her lips parted, but she didn't argue. She nodded slowly, her face ashen, her breath shallow. She looked like someone waiting for a sentence she already knew was coming. Kara, standing silently behind the desk, kept her head down, pretending to be busy. She didn't want to be caught in the fallout, though the atmosphere made it impossible not to feel part of it. Mr. Franklin motioned to one of the bellhops, who stepped forward with 2 fresh sets of keycards. "Room 2701, he said, looking at Keanu. "Your belongings will be transferred. We'll have a team standing by if you need anything else." Keanu nodded once. "Thank you." The bellhop handed the keycards directly to Sandra. She took them quietly, then looked once more toward Heather, but said nothing. And with that, Sandra and Keanu turned toward the elevators. They didn't hurry, they didn't speak, they simply walked, step by step, through the lobby that had now grown completely silent. As Sandra and Keanu walked toward the elevator, every head in the lounge turned with them. No one whispered anymore. No one checked their phones. No one even dared to move. The silence wasn't just out of respect. It was the quiet that follows when people witness something that changes how they see the world around them. A guest near the bar slowly lifted their phone and began recording. Not for attention, not for social media clout, just to capture the moment. There was something reverent about the way the camera remained still, not zooming, not panning, just observing. Sandra's steps were steady, her shoulders relaxed but poised. She didn't need to say anything more. Her presence, her composure, carried everything the situation had demanded. Keanu walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on the strap of her duffel bag, now slung over his shoulder. Neither of them looked back. The elevator bell chimed softly. A staff member waiting nearby stepped forward to press the button, bowing her head slightly without saying a word. As the doors opened, Sandra glanced briefly at the suite number printed on the keycard in her hand. She didn't smile, she didn't frown, she just nodded to herself and stepped inside. Keanu followed close behind, and as the elevator doors closed, sealing them off from the eyes and whispers below, the weight in the room remained behind them, pressing down on those who had watched, those who had recorded, and especially on one person who now stood utterly alone at the reception desk. Heather. She hadn't moved since Mr. Franklin asked to speak with her. Her hands were still clasped in front of her, fingers curled tightly. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, but her mind was spiraling. Every second since the elevator closed felt longer than the last. She felt the stares now. Not direct ones, but the kind that prick at the back of your neck, reminding you that no one had forgotten what they'd just witnessed. She didn't need to look up to know that someone had likely already uploaded the recording, and she didn't need to ask if it was going viral. She could feel it in the way people had started avoiding eye contact, not to spare her dignity, but because they no longer saw her the same way. The uniform she wore, the badge she once wore like armor, now felt heavy, uncomfortable, and worse, meaningless. Mr. Franklin stepped toward her again. His tone was lower now, meant only for her. "In my office. Now." Heather nodded. It was barely more than a twitch of the head, but it was all she could manage. She turned, moving slowly, walking toward the corridor behind the front desk that led to the administrative wing. Her steps were small, careful, as if each one might cause the fragile floor beneath her to collapse. Heather moved through the back hallway like someone walking underwater. The air felt thick, every step more difficult than the last. The murmurs from the lobby had faded now, swallowed by the narrow corridor lined with framed black and white photos of famous guests who had once passed through the Bellcourt's doors. She had once looked at those photos with pride. Now, she couldn't meet their eyes. Mr. Franklin walked silently behind her, not rushing, not speaking. There was no need for dramatics. Everything had already unfolded in public view. This part, this quiet, personal reckoning, was simply the conclusion that had been waiting. She reached the door marked manager and hesitated for half a second before opening it. He followed her in, then closed it softly behind them. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. The office was clean and dimly lit. A mahogany desk stood in the center, spotless. On the wall was a small shelf with awards, plaques, and commendations for excellence in service. Heather had always imagined herself earning one of those someday. Now she couldn't even look at them. Mr. Franklin walked around the desk and sat down without a word. He didn't ask her to sit. She remained standing, her fingers knotted tightly together in front of her. "Heather," he said, finally breaking the silence, "you know why we're here?" She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "Yes, sir. I gave you this job because you were sharp, efficient, confident. You handled difficult guests well, but what I saw out there tonight..." He trailed off and shook his head. "That wasn't professionalism. That was prejudice." Heather blinked fast, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it quickly. "It wasn't intentional, I swear." He didn't react to that. Did she raise her voice? No. Did she threaten you? No. Did she have valid ID and confirmation? Yes. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. Then what was the problem? Heather couldn't answer. He let the silence sit for a moment, then leaned forward. "The problem, Heather, is that you didn't see her, not really. You saw her hoodie, her sneakers, her quiet voice, and you made a decision about who she was before she ever told you." Heather looked down. "And what makes it worse," he continued, "is that you didn't do this in private. You did it in front of guests, staff, a man who commands global respect, and a woman who deserves far more of it than she got from you tonight." Heather's voice cracked. "I know. Do you?" She nodded slowly, but he wasn't convinced. I don't know if this is something you can recover from here, Heather, not just because of who she is, but because of what you showed the rest of us. He paused again, then said it plainly. Think very carefully about what you want to do next, because this hotel may not be the place for that version of you anymore. Heather closed her eyes. She didn't argue, because deep down, she knew he was right. Heather remained standing in the center of Mr. Franklin's office. Her hands were folded tightly at her waist, but even that failed to hide how badly they trembled. She had stood behind that front desk for nearly 2 years, memorized every policy, every procedure, every name of every VIP guest who had ever stayed at the Bellcourt. She had prided herself on being composed, polished, always in control. But now, with just one mistake, one quiet, calculated dismissal, everything she had built was unraveling around her. Mr. Franklin sat still behind his desk, elbows resting gently on the armrests. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her. Not with anger, that would have been easier to face. Instead, it was the unmistakable weight of disappointment. I saw everything, he finally said. His voice was quiet, deliberate. The moment she walked in, you started making decisions. Heather's throat tightened. Sir, I just didn't recognize her, that's all. If I had known it was Sandra Bullock. He raised his hand, stopping her. That's the problem, Heather, he said sharply, though his voice never rose. You shouldn't have needed to recognize her. It's not our job to wait until someone's famous before we treat them like they matter. Heather's lips trembled. I didn't mean to be rude. But you were, he said. You were dismissive. You suggested she go somewhere cheaper. You rolled your eyes. You smirked at her. You brushed off the very information she showed you, and all of that, every bit of it, happened in front of other guests? Heather lowered her gaze. Her voice barely came out. I thought the system didn't show her name. I really believed that. Mr. Franklin didn't reach for his computer. Instead, he picked up his phone from the desk and tapped the screen. You believed that, he said, but the rest of the world didn't. He turned the phone toward her. On it was a still image of Sandra and Keanu standing together in the lobby. Keanu's hand rested on Sandra's shoulder. Heather was frozen behind the front desk, looking stunned. At the top of the post, a caption read, "Luxury hotel staff disrespects Sandra Bullock. Keanu Reeves steps in." Heather's stomach dropped. Her name wasn't even in the caption, but everyone knew who that receptionist was. Heather stared at the photo, unable to breathe. Her reflection was right there, frozen in time, framed by polished marble and gold trim, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. She remembered that exact moment. She had watched Keanu Reeves step forward. She had heard Sandra's silence speak louder than any confrontation. She hadn't realized someone had taken a picture, or that someone had already turned it into a headline. Mr. Franklin didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He set the phone down between them and waited. Heather stepped forward slowly, her voice small and broken. I didn't know it would turn into this. He leaned forward. You think this is about a headline? This isn't about the internet, Heather. This is about who you are when no one is watching. I wasn't trying to be cruel. But you were, he replied. Because you didn't care who she was. You looked at her shoes, her hoodie, her tired face, and you decided she wasn't worth your effort. Heather gripped the back of the chair across from his desk, trying to steady herself. I made a mistake. I panicked. When I realized who she was, You shouldn't have needed a name to do your job, he cut in again. Sandra Bullock or not, she showed you her ID, her confirmation. She followed every rule we ask our guests to follow, and you broke every one we claim to live by. Heather felt the tears rising again. I've worked here for years. I've given everything to this hotel. I've never had a single guest complaint. He raised an eyebrow. Until tonight? She dropped into the chair, unable to stay standing. Her voice trembled. Please, this is my life, my career. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Mr. Franklin shook his head slowly. "That's what worries me most." Heather looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this wasn't a heat-of-the-moment slip. You didn't lash out. You didn't lose your temper. You were calm, controlled, dismissive. Everything you did on purpose. And that tells me this isn't a mistake. It's a habit." Heather buried her face in her hands. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who she was." Mr. Franklin let out a long, exhausted breath. "If that's your defense, then you're missing the point." He opened his laptop, tapped a few keys, and turned the screen to her. A second image was already circulating, a short video clip. It was blurry, but the moment was unmistakable. Sandra showing her phone, Heather refusing to look at it, brushing her off, suggesting another hotel. The comment section was brutal. She handled it with such grace. "Keanu is class as always." Fire that receptionist. Imagine treating a stranger like that, and what if it wasn't Sandra Bullock? Heather stared at the comments, her shoulders collapsing inward. She knew there was no spinning this, no email that would fix it, no statement she could give to make it all go away. People had seen it. People had felt it. And it wasn't going to disappear because she regretted it now. Mr. Franklin closed the laptop gently and folded his hands. "I can't have someone representing this hotel who chooses who deserves respect based on appearances. I can't have a manager wondering if the next VIP guest will be handled properly. I can't have this reputation attached to our name." Heather braced herself, and then the words came. "You're dismissed." It didn't feel like a shout or a punishment. It felt like a verdict, one she had delivered to herself the moment she judged a guest without even checking her name. Heather stood in the hallway just outside Mr. Franklin's office, her breath shaky, her throat dry. Her hands trembled at her sides. She had nothing to carry, no purse, no clipboard, no headset, just the uniform that had once meant authority, now hanging on her shoulders like a weight. Her red eyes stared at the floor. She could hear the soft hum of conversation from the lobby beyond the hallway, but it wasn't the same murmur she was used to. It was heavier, sharper, aimed. She took one step forward and then another, until the light from the main lobby fell across her shoes. She moved quietly, hoping no one would notice, but knowing full well they already had. Her face burned. Every guest in the room had seen what happened. Every staff member knew why she had disappeared. She passed the front desk. Kara was now helping an older couple. Her voice polite but clipped. Kara didn't look up, didn't say a word. Heather knew she wouldn't. She didn't expect anyone to anymore. As she walked past the lounge, heads turned. Some didn't bother to hide it. A few whispered, their voices soft but clear enough to sting. "That's her," is the one from the video. "She's the one who told Sandra Bullock to leave." Heather kept walking. Her footsteps were steady, but inside she felt hollow, like the floor beneath her could give out at any moment. The bar came into view. The same man who had taken the photo earlier now sat with his drink, arms folded, watching her with no expression. His phone rested on the bar. The screen was still lit with the post. She didn't look him in the eye. She didn't look at anyone. Just the exit. The tall glass doors loomed ahead, the same ones Sandra had entered through not long ago. Only now, Heather didn't walk through them with confidence. She walked toward them stripped of her place, stripped of her power. The doorman didn't move to open them for her. He only watched as she pushed the door open herself and stepped into the drizzle outside. The rain fell lightly, soaking her blazer in seconds. But she didn't stop to shield herself. She didn't pull up her collar. She just stood there for a moment motionless, letting the rain wash over her. Heather stood still on the sidewalk, her back to the hotel, the rain settling into her hair like pinpricks of consequence. The street was quiet, muffled by the mist and the hour, but inside her mind, everything screamed. She had thought she was untouchable. She believed her position meant something, that her judgments went unquestioned. But now, after one careless moment, one smug smirk, one miscalculation, she was nobody. The drizzle thickened into a steady rain. Still, she didn't move. Cars passed behind her in a slow rhythm, drivers unaware of the storm happening inside her. Her makeup had started to run. Her breath formed short clouds in the cool air, but her chest felt hot with shame. She took a hesitant step down the stone staircase that led to the curb. A valet rushed past her without acknowledging her. She wasn't part of the inner circle anymore. She wasn't staff. She wasn't guest. She was nothing. A ghost floating on the edge of luxury, with nowhere to go. The wind picked up, pushing her damp hair across her face. She pulled it back with shaking fingers. Somewhere behind her, the hotel doors opened again, but she didn't turn around. She didn't want to know who was watching her. She could feel their eyes, the same ones that once obeyed her instructions, now watching her unravel in real time. She walked slowly down the sidewalk, passing flower beds and parked cars. Her heels clicked against the wet pavement, uneven and unsure. She passed the front of the hotel's coffee bar, where guests sat behind steamed windows, sipping espresso and pretending not to look. But they looked. Of course they looked. She could feel the weight of it pressing into her back. A woman in a red trench coat passed by going the other way. Her eyes flicked over Heather and then snapped forward again, like seeing something pitiful. Heather's hands clenched. She wanted to scream, to explain, to say she didn't mean it the way it looked, but she knew none of it mattered. The internet had already judged her. The caption said it all. Luxury hotel receptionist disrespects Sandra Bullock. Keanu Reeves steps in. It was already spreading. Somewhere out there, thousands were watching that short, blurry clip. They were retweeting it, adding comments, some sarcastic, some furious, some vowing to boycott the hotel. She imagined her name trending for all the wrong reasons. Not Heather Simmons, top receptionist, just Heather, the face of snobbery and humiliation. She turned the corner and reached the back lot where employees sometimes parked. Her car sat there, cold and alone, like her. She fumbled for the keys in her blazer pocket. When she opened the door, she finally exhaled, but it didn't bring relief, just a rush of nausea. She dropped into the driver's seat, gripped the wheel, and let the silence fall heavy over her. The rain tapped softly against the windshield. She leaned her forehead on the wheel. What had she done? She didn't hate Sandra Bullock. She had even liked her movies. But that night, in the rush of her own ego, she had judged a soaked woman in a hoodie and made her feel small. And now she was the one shrinking, barely able to hold herself upright. A ping on her phone broke the silence. She hesitated, then picked it up. It was a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. "Is this you?" it said. Attached was a screen capture from the viral video. Her heart dropped. She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and covered her face with both hands. No words could undo what had already been seen. No explanation would soften the blow. The image was out there now, a still frame of failure, the lesson carved into digital stone. She looked up at the rearview mirror. Her reflection stared back, pale, damp, tired. There was no defiance in it, only regret. The suite was quiet, dimly lit by the soft glow of a single lamp near the window. Rain tapped faintly against the glass, a gentle rhythm that filled the silence. Sandra sat on the edge of the plush sofa, her hoodie still damp around the sleeves, her fingers interlaced in her lap. Keanu sat beside her, not too close, not too far, just enough to feel the weight of shared understanding between them. She exhaled slowly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to come." Keanu didn't respond right away. He leaned back, arms resting on his knees, eyes gazing ahead into nothing in particular. "Yes," he said finally. "I did." That simple sentence didn't need embellishment. Sandra looked over at him, eyes glistening not with tears, but with the complicated feeling of being seen. Truly seen. In a moment where she felt small and invisible to the world. She shook her head slightly, half in gratitude, half in disbelief. "I've been in this business for decades," she said. "You'd think I'd stop being surprised." Keanu turned toward her now. "Not surprised by them," he said. "Surprised by how it still stings." Sandra gave a sad smile. "Exactly." She leaned back, letting her body sink into the couch. The comfort of the cushions contrasted the discomfort inside her chest. After a moment, she spoke again, softer this time, as though unearthing something long buried. "There was a time, early in my career, when I went to this small film festival. I wasn't famous. I barely had enough for the plane ticket. I showed up in jeans and a t-shirt, exhausted, hoping just to watch from the back. The ticket clerk looked me up and down and told me the press lounge was for professionals only. I turned around to leave, embarrassed, but someone behind me, some older producer I didn't even know, he stepped forward and said, 'She belongs here.'" Keanu listened without interrupting, his expression open and still. "That moment," Sandra continued, "it didn't change my career, but it changed how I carried myself the next day. One person can do that. One voice." There was a pause. Then she looked at him fully now. "I guess you're that stranger today." He didn't smile in the way people do when accepting praise. He nodded gently, acknowledging the weight of what she said. "You've been that for others too," he replied. "I've heard the stories." Sandra looked down, thoughtful. "I try, but sometimes I forget how much it still hurts when the world makes you feel less than." All it took was a hoodie and a tired face. "And a gatekeeper," Keanu added quietly. They both went silent again. Outside, the city lights blurred through rain. In that quiet space, they weren't movie stars, they weren't icons. They were just two people who had spent their lives being watched, sometimes misunderstood, and tonight, fully understood by each other. Sandra leaned her head back against the cushion, her gaze drifting to the ornate ceiling above. The room was beautiful, five-star elegance, soft gold accents, fresh flowers on the coffee table. But none of that comfort could erase the sting of earlier. Not yet. "You know," she said, her voice slower now, "it's strange how people talk about fame like it's armor, like being known protects you from being hurt, but sometimes it just makes the cuts quieter." Keanu nodded. "Because they think you're invincible. And if you complain, you're ungrateful," she added. "If you stay silent, you're cold. If you speak up, you're dramatic." She turned to him, eyes steady. "Thank you for not staying silent." He held her gaze a moment. "You never have," he said, "so I won't either." Sandra smiled gently, but it faded as another thought surfaced. "I keep thinking about all the people who walk into hotels or restaurants and get treated like that every day, without anyone to speak up for them, without anyone filming or caring or writing a headline. That could have been anyone tonight." Keanu sat up a little straighter. "It was you, but it could have been a nurse after a night shift," he said. "Or a mother carrying 3 kids in a suitcase. Or a guy who just lost his job and needs a place to stay. They all deserve dignity." Sandra exhaled, deeply moved. "We're lucky, Keanu. We can afford the suite. We can leave a bad experience behind. But some people carry it for years." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's why these moments matter. They seem small, but they echo." The room fell quiet again, but the silence felt meaningful now. A warm silence, filled with mutual reflection. Then Sandra chuckled softly. "I still can't believe she called me ma'am and told me the system was down." "She didn't look past your hoodie," Keanu said. "She didn't hear your voice, didn't recognize your presence. She saw a stereotype and stopped there." "And now she's trending," Sandra murmured. "I don't want her to be shamed forever, but I hope she learns something." "She will," Keanu replied. "Everyone does eventually. The hard way or the right way." Sandra glanced over at him again. "You always come out of nowhere like that. Quiet, calm, but somehow you flip the whole situation and then disappear like nothing happened." He smiled faintly. "I just try not to add noise. But I won't ignore injustice." "You didn't," she said. "And that's why I'm sitting here, not crying in an Uber." Keanu's expression softened. "You never needed anyone to defend you, but sometimes it's okay to let someone stand beside you." Sandra looked down at her hands, the same ones that had knocked on the front desk, unacknowledged. The same hands that had lifted awards, wiped away tears, and signed countless autographs. Tonight, they had been invisible. Until Keanu saw them. She placed one of them gently over his. "Thank you," she whispered. And for a moment, in a suite high above the city, surrounded by fame and silence, two old friends simply sat in the quiet power of human connection. Outside the suite window, the city lights blinked against the rain. Inside, neither of them spoke. No headlines, no scripts, just the truth of being seen. Sandra leaned back, eyes misty, and Keanu remained still. In that silence, something deeper was restored. Not reputation, not revenge, just quiet, mutual respect. The morning light spilled gently across the polished floors of the Bellcourt's lobby, softening the usual harsh edges of its sleek design. The chandeliers that once sparkled with cold indifference now felt like they were holding their breath. There was a nervous rhythm in the way the staff moved. No longer the breezy, dismissive confidence of yesterday, but something measured, cautious, intentional. Every uniform was perfectly tucked, every shoe gleaming, every movement sharp. The atmosphere had shifted. At the front desk stood a new receptionist, a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes and an expression that blended professionalism with humility. She glanced down the corridor as she heard the elevator chime. When the doors opened, Keanu and Sandra stepped out together. They didn't speak as they entered the lobby. They didn't need to. Their presence drew the attention of every person in the room. The receptionist immediately stepped forward with a warm but restrained smile. "Good morning, Mr. Reeves, Ms. Bullock. I hope your evening was restful," she said. Sandra gave her a polite nod, while Keanu offered a small smile. Both of them noticed the shift. It wasn't just about recognition anymore. It was about fear and respect, but mostly fear of being the next Heather. Mr. Franklin, the manager, emerged from the hallway near the concierge desk, dressed immaculately in a tailored navy suit. His posture was straight, his face composed but wary. He moved quickly toward them, hands folded respectfully in front of him. "Mr. Reeves, Miss Bullock," he began, voice steady but softer than the night before. "Please accept our sincerest apologies again for yesterday's lapse in judgment. We'd like to offer you a complimentary extension of your stay, a private suite upgrade, full access to our spa services, and breakfast on the terrace." Sandra glanced sideways at Keanu. She didn't need words to communicate the emotion behind her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. Keanu understood. Sandra looked back at the manager. "That's generous," she said, voice level. "But we're not staying." The receptionist blinked, clearly surprised. Mr. Franklin hesitated, his practiced composure faltering slightly. "I see," he said, pausing. "If there's anything else we can offer to make this right." Keanu raised his hand gently, his tone calm. "Sometimes making it right means letting it change you." Mr. Franklin nodded slowly, understood. They turned toward the entrance, their luggage already waiting, likely arranged out of nervous anticipation. As they walked, a hush fell over the room. Staff members lowered their heads. A few murmured apologies under their breath, soft, uncertain, but sincere. The weight of their footsteps echoed softly across the marble, as they moved through the lobby. There was no fanfare, no dramatic farewell, just silence. The kind that follows a revelation. The kind that settles over people when they realize they've witnessed something more important than luxury or protocol. A kind of silence that demanded reflection. Sandra and Keanu passed the bar where they had once been overlooked. Now, not a single pair of eyes dared dismiss them. Several staff members standing near the concierge desk subtly stepped aside, clearing the path, not out of obligation, but something more solemn. A quiet reverence had replaced yesterday's casual arrogance. Outside the glass doors, the day was fresh with the scent of dew and possibility. A black town car waited curbside. The driver stepped out, opened the door, and nodded respectfully. Keanu paused at the threshold, then turned slightly to glance back into the lobby. His eyes moved across the faces. No hostility, no smugness, just a quiet, collective lesson learned. He gave a single nod, not of pride but of acknowledgement, that sometimes change didn't require grand speeches or confrontation. Sometimes it was found in silence, in stillness, in walking away with dignity. Sandra stepped beside him, wrapping her coat a little tighter. "It's different now," she said softly. Keanu nodded. "It will be, maybe not for all the right reasons, but it will be." She smiled faintly. "You ever wonder how many moments like this we never see?" "All the time," Keanu replied. "But the ones we do see, they count." They climbed into the car. The door closed gently behind them, muffling the world outside. The driver pulled away, leaving the Bellcourt Hotel in their rearview mirror. Inside the lobby, the silence lingered like perfume. Mr. Franklin watched them go, hands still folded in front of him. Behind him, the new receptionist adjusted her posture. Even her breathing seemed more careful, more measured. In the hotel's back office, a memo was already being drafted by corporate. Staff sensitivity training. Discretion protocol. The usual checklist when a PR storm brews, but this time it wasn't only about the public image. Something in Mr. Franklin's eyes suggested he was genuinely changed. Out front, the glass doors slowly closed, but something had been left open. A sense of accountability. A reminder of how quickly power can shift, and how deeply the smallest act of kindness or cruelty could echo. As the car eased onto the boulevard, Sandra leaned back, watching the city wake up. The streets were coming alive, commuters, dog walkers, cafe doors swinging open. But something about the quiet between them felt like the real conclusion. Keanu looked over. "You okay?" She gave a small nod. "It's strange. That whole experience, it wasn't about me, not really. It was about everyone who's ever been made to feel small," Keanu said. "And what happens when someone decides not to let it go?" Sandra let his words settle before replying. "I used to think silence was grace, that walking away without a word showed strength, but now I wonder if sometimes silence lets things continue." "Depends on the silence," Keanu said. "Yesterday, yours spoke louder than any argument could." She smiled softly. "So did yours." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. At a red light, a pedestrian crossing the street looked into the car and did a double take. Recognition lit his face, but he didn't pull out a phone. He simply offered a small nod of respect. Keanu returned it with the same quiet grace that had become his legacy. The light turned green. The car moved forward. Back at the Bellcourt, a staff meeting was being scheduled. Heather's name was no longer on the roster, but her shadow lingered as a silent caution, one that would shape how that lobby greeted people from now on. And maybe, in that small way, something good had begun. The car hummed softly beneath them as it rolled through the streets, the morning light stretching across the windshield. Sandra sat with her phone in her lap, her fingers hovering over the screen. Keanu glanced at her from time to time, quiet, patient. When she finally opened her notifications, the screen lit up with a storm she hadn't expected. The video was everywhere. A guest at the hotel had captured Keanu's calm, deliberate words in the lobby, the way he stepped between her and humiliation. The post had been uploaded just 6 hours ago. It had over 2 million views already and was climbing by the second. Comment after comment scrolled by beneath it, a digital flood of voices. Keanu's not just an actor, he's a reminder of what grace looks like. She didn't recognize Sandra Bullock? That's not even the issue. The way she treated her was disgusting. I was treated this way once at a hotel. I never forgot how it made me feel. The video had been reposted by major outlets. Hollywood Insider, Justice Daily, even Morning America's official account. Screenshots showed Keanu standing still in the lobby, hands calmly folded, while Heather's expression crumbled. Another image captured Sandra, her hoodie pulled slightly forward, lips tight with controlled dignity. Sandra turned the screen toward Keanu. "It's everywhere," she said softly. He looked, nodded once. "It was bound to be," she exhaled. "I never wanted this to become that." "I know," he said, "but sometimes silence allows the wrong story to win." She glanced back at the screen. New headlines appeared every few seconds. Luxury hotel employee fired after disrespecting Sandra Bullock. Keanu Reeves responds with class. Kindness in a hoodie, how one celebrity stood for another without saying a word too loud. Beneath the trending videos were thousands of personal stories. People sharing how they, too, had been judged for how they looked, what they wore, the way they spoke. Some were heartbreaking. Some were furious. Some simply said, "Thank you." Sandra leaned back, letting her head rest against the leather seat. "You know what's strange? I didn't even feel embarrassed last night. I felt tired. Tired of being seen and not seen at the same time." Keanu didn't answer immediately. He let her words settle into the quiet hum of the drive. "When I saw her face," he said finally, "I thought of all the people who never get defended, who don't have someone behind them." She turned to him. He added, "The camera didn't matter, you did." Sandra sat forward again and scrolled through the comments, her brow furrowing at the sheer intensity of engagement. There was something deeper happening beneath the surface of all the praise. People weren't just applauding Keanu or her. They were remembering things. Times they were turned away, ignored, spoken to like they didn't matter. One woman wrote, "I was once told I couldn't afford a bracelet at a jewelry store. My husband had passed just 2 weeks earlier, and I was trying to buy something to remember him by." Another read, "I'm a nurse. I wear scrubs everywhere. One time I walked into a boutique and was followed the entire time by the clerk. They thought I'd steal something. I just wanted a dress for my daughter's graduation." Sandra's voice caught in her throat as she read one more. "Respect should not come with a price tag." She turned her phone off. "It's not about fame," she whispered. Keanu looked over. She repeated it more firmly. "It's about dignity." He nodded. "And dignity doesn't require a red carpet." Outside, they passed a billboard featuring a luxury watch ad. The irony was heavy. Sandra, in a hoodie, had been seen as less than human, but the woman on the billboard, flawless and filtered, commanded deference. A vibration on her phone pulled her eyes back. A text from her publicist read, "Do you want to issue a formal statement? Everyone's watching." Sandra showed it to Keanu. He thought a moment. "What would you say?" She shrugged. "Nothing, maybe. Maybe silence is the statement." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Or maybe just one sentence. One that reminds people not who you are, but what they are." Sandra stared at the passing scenery. Then her eyes narrowed. "Got it." She unlocked her phone and opened her notes app. With a few quiet taps, she typed, "I wasn't looking for respect, I was looking for humanity. Let's start there." She pressed send. Within 10 minutes, it was reposted more than 50,000 times. The car slowed as they approached the airport terminal. A few people waiting at the curb noticed them through the tinted windows, pointing subtly, but not rushing forward. Something had shifted, not just in the online world, but in the real one too. Sandra stepped out first. She didn't hide behind sunglasses or duck her head. She walked with ease, not as a celebrity, but as someone who had just remembered her worth, had nothing to do with recognition. Keanu followed beside her. His phone buzzed as they moved through the terminal, a quiet alert from one of his assistants. "Your name is trending across multiple continents." Again. He slid the phone back into his pocket without reading more. At security, a TSA officer offered a discreet nod. "Thank you for what you did." Keanu met his eyes. "For doing what anyone should." The officer smiled. "Not everyone does." They walked on. As they reached their gate, Sandra's phone lit up once more. Her post now had nearly 2 million likes. Dozens of influential voices had shared it. Activists, teachers, nurses, artists. Not because it was famous, but because it was true. She looked at Keanu and said softly, "Maybe that seed you talked about. Maybe it's sprouting." He looked out the window toward the runway. "Then it's our job to water it." She smiled, quietly, gratefully, and without another word, they sat down to wait for their flight. Two friends, quietly changing the world, one act at a time. Heather sat alone in a corner booth of a small cafe tucked between a laundromat and a dry cleaner on a quieter side street. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy over the city. She wrapped her fingers around a chipped ceramic mug, filled with lukewarm coffee that had long since gone bitter, much like the thoughts racing through her head. Across from her sat an untouched bagel, the cream cheese beginning to congeal. But Heather wasn't hungry. Her phone rested on the table, screen lit up with the video, the one she couldn't escape. Keanu Reeves, standing calmly but firmly in the Bellcourt lobby, shielding Sandra Bullock from her scornful judgment. Her own voice, sharp, dismissive, unmistakably hers, echoed from the speaker. The video had been trimmed down to 45 seconds, just enough to expose her tone, her expression, her mistake. Millions of people had already seen it. Millions more were still clicking. She scrolled through the comments. She should never work in customer service again. Classic case of judging a book by its cover. This is why people hate luxury service culture. She didn't even look at her. How do you treat anyone like that? Bet she's crying now. Good. Heather's chest tightened. A sinking weight filled her. She had made a mistake. She knew that. But she hadn't expected the entire internet to rise up and crush her under its judgment. A new notification popped up. Her name was trending. Not the glamorous kind of trending people hoped for, the kind that made hiring managers whisper and acquaintances delete your number. She opened her text messages. At the top was a single message from her mother. "Heather, what did you do?" She stared at the words for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the reply button, but never tapped. What could she say? Her mother wasn't someone who threw around disappointment easily. She had worked 2 jobs to put Heather through college, helped her move to the city, celebrated her getting a job at Bellcourt with tears in her eyes. Heather had promised she would make her proud. Instead, she had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. The cafe was quiet except for the low hum of conversation and the occasional clink of silverware. Across the room, a young couple laughed over a shared plate of pancakes. A toddler in a high chair clapped along to a song only he could hear. Life went on around her, ordinary and unbothered, while Heather's world felt like it was crumbling in real time. She brought the mug to her lips again, the bitterness of the coffee matching the acid in her stomach. Every few minutes she refreshed the video. More comments, more shares. Another friend from college unfollowed her on social media. She noticed one had even posted a vague tweet that said, "Don't be a Heather." It had nearly 3,000 likes. Her hands trembled. She turned her phone screen down on the table and closed her eyes. But even in the silence, she could still hear the video. Her voice. That moment. The way she looked past Sandra like she was invisible, like she was nothing. She hadn't just failed as a professional. She had failed as a human being. She remembered the way Mr. Franklin had looked at her. Disappointed, but not surprised. That was the part that really stung. Not the firing, not the public shaming, but the fact that someone she respected had seen right through her. The door of the cafe opened and closed with a soft jingle. Heather glanced up automatically. An older man in a delivery uniform stepped in. He smiled at the barista, called her by name, and handed over a small package. Just a man doing his job, being kind. Heather looked away, ashamed. She had worked at Bellcourt for 4 years. She couldn't remember the names of most of the staff who worked night shifts. She had been so focused on upward mobility, she never looked sideways or down. A waitress came by to check on her. She was young, probably in college, with tired eyes but a kind smile. "You want a refill?" she asked gently. Heather opened her mouth to decline, but then paused. "Sure. Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. The waitress nodded and walked off. It was such a simple exchange, a small act of service, offered without judgment. Heather stared at the half-empty mug, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't even been that kind to Sandra Bullock, or to the dozens of guests before her. That moment stayed with her. Not the hate online, not the comments, but that moment. Because when the waitress returned and refilled her cup without asking for payment, Heather looked up and managed the smallest, most sincere thank you she'd spoken in a long time. The girl just smiled. "Rough day?" Heather hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "Really rough." The girl didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She just offered a quiet, understanding nod before walking away. And for the first time since the storm had started, Heather felt a flicker of something. Not hope exactly, not yet. But maybe the very beginning of understanding. Maybe this was what rock bottom looked like. Watch, maybe. It could also be where a new kind of life started. Heather sat back in the booth, the fresh steam rising from her refilled cup curling upward like a quiet reminder. She scrolled once more through the chaos on her phone, but this time she didn't linger on the hate. She stopped at one simple comment buried among thousands. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do after." Her chest tightened. She set the phone down, both hands cupping the warmth of the mug. Outside, the clouds finally began to break, a thin shaft of light cutting across the damp street. Maybe this wasn't the end, she thought. Maybe it was only the consequence. Or maybe, if she chose differently, it could be her beginning. The Bellcourt lobby looked the same at first glance. The same polished marble floors, the same chandeliers scattering soft light, the same arrangement of velvet chairs. But beneath the surface, the air felt different. Gone was the faint air of superiority that once clung to the place like perfume. Now there was something quieter, steadier. A deliberate awareness. Mr. Franklin stood in the center of the room with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. Around him gathered the entire morning staff, receptionists, concierges, bellhops, and housekeepers. He spoke with a calm gravity that everyone felt. "We are not just here to check people in," he said. "We are not just here to polish marble or deliver bags. We are here to recognize people as people. Last night reminded us that every guest has a story we cannot see. We are not here to judge those stories. We are here to serve with dignity." The staff listened carefully. No one shifted, no one checked their watches. Even Kara, who had been at the desk during the incident, stood still, her expression serious. Everyone knew what he was talking about, without him naming it. He lifted the clipboard, reading a short line from the notes he had prepared. "Starting today, we are implementing a new standard. Empathy first. Efficiency and polish still matter, but empathy comes first. A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the staff. One of the younger bellhops raised his hand cautiously. "What does that mean exactly?" Mr. Franklin smiled faintly. "It means that when someone walks through those doors, you don't decide who they are before you speak to them. You don't measure their worth by their shoes or their coat or their silence. You treat them as if they matter. Because they do." The bellhop nodded, the words settling on his shoulders like a responsibility he hadn't carried before. Later that afternoon, a framed quote appeared on the wall behind the reception desk. It was simple, written in gold lettering on white parchment. "Every guest has a story you can't see. Treat them like it matters." It caught the eye immediately. Some guests paused to read it. Some smiled. Some simply carried on. But the words lingered in the space, shifting the rhythm of the lobby in ways subtle but undeniable. That evening, when a woman in rain-damp clothes entered the hotel holding the hand of her young son, the receptionist didn't glance at her sneakers. She leaned forward with a warm smile. "Welcome to the Bellcourt. May I see your name, please?" The woman's shoulders relaxed, almost as if she had braced for rejection. The boy clutched his toy car and looked around at the tall ceilings with wide eyes. The receptionist handed them their keys with genuine warmth. For once, the hotel felt less like a gate and more like a home. As the woman walked away, Mr. Franklin stood nearby, watching. He nodded to himself. The lesson had landed. Guests began to notice the shift almost immediately. It wasn't in grand gestures or rehearsed apologies. It was in the little things. The way a bellhop met their eyes instead of rushing past. The way a receptionist asked if their trip had been tiring before requesting ID. The way staff smiled without calculation. The Bellcourt no longer felt like a fortress of marble and chandeliers. It felt at last like a place where people were welcomed rather than measured. A businessman in a wrinkled suit checked in late one evening. Normally, his disheveled appearance would have earned skeptical looks. Instead, the concierge offered him tea and asked if he needed a wake-up call for the morning. The man accepted with quiet gratitude, surprised by the kindness. Later, a family traveling with 3 young children spilled juice on the lobby rug. Instead of irritated sighs and whispered judgments, 2 housekeepers rushed over with towels and a smile. "Don't worry about it," one said warmly. The mother nearly cried from relief. By the end of the week, the change was unmistakable. Guests who had visited the Bellcourt before noticed and commented. "The service feels different," one woman remarked. "Less staged, more real." Mr. Franklin listened to these words with a sense of humility. He knew the hotel had been forced into change by circumstance, but he also knew the responsibility now lay with him to sustain it. He often caught himself staring at the framed quote behind the desk, letting the words steady him. "Every guest has a story you can't see. Treat them like it matters." On Sandra and Keanu's final morning at the Bellcourt, the lobby carried that new stillness. Staff stood taller, not out of fear, but out of intent. Even the smallest gestures, a smile, a nod, a door held open, were different now. It was no longer arrogance polished to a shine, but humility practiced into habit. As they wheeled their bags toward the exit, a bellhop hurried ahead to hold the glass door open. He didn't speak at first, only lowered his head slightly. Then, almost shyly, he said, "Thank you for what you did here." Sandra paused, taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. She offered a gentle smile. "We didn't do anything extraordinary." "You reminded us," the bellhop replied softly, "that people matter more than appearances. We won't forget." Keanu gave a small nod, one of his simple, understated acknowledgments that said more than words could. Together, they stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind not just a hotel, but a place changed by one night's lesson. Inside, the framed words on the wall gleamed under the morning light. Guests read them, staff lived them, and the Bellcourt began to rebuild its reputation, not through luxury, but through empathy. The lobby that once echoed with judgment now carried something else entirely: reverence. And in the quiet way of such things, the story of that night would linger, not just online, not just in headlines, but in the very fabric of how the Bellcourt welcomed the world from that day forward. The room was hushed, the kind of silence that comes only after a long day of being surrounded by eyes, whispers, and constant reminders of how visible life could be. Sandra sat at the desk near the window, a leather-bound journal open in front of her, pen resting lightly between her fingers. Outside, the city glowed with scattered lights, reflections bending across the rain-streaked glass. She exhaled, then began to write. It shouldn't take a famous friend to be treated fairly. Her pen moved, slowly at first, the words forming in delicate strokes. She paused, looking at them as though they were heavier than the ink that shaped them. Then she continued. I think about how many people go through this every single day. They're judged by a coat that looks worn, by shoes that aren't polished, by a silence mistaken for weakness. They don't have someone to step in for them. They don't have cameras to capture the truth. They don't have the internet rushing to their defense. Her hand steadied as she wrote. It breaks my heart to think how many nights end in humiliation. How many people walk home with shoulders bent under the weight of someone else's assumptions. And no one ever knows. No video, no article, just another quiet wound. She set the pen down and rubbed her temple. The memory of Heather's smirk, the dismissive tone, still clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. Sandra had endured years of red carpets, interviews, speculation. She had built thick skin out of necessity. But the encounter reminded her of something more personal, how fragile dignity could be when left in the hands of another. Her gaze drifted to the journal again. Fame has always been a strange kind of armor. It protects you sometimes, it exposes you other times. But dignity, real dignity, shouldn't depend on that. It should be the baseline for everyone, everywhere. The clock on the nightstand ticked softly, marking the late hour. Sandra reached for her pen again, driven by the quiet urgency of unfinished thought. August said, I wish I could say last night was an exception. But it isn't. It's the rule for too many. And maybe the only difference between me and them is that people recognize my name. That feels unfair in a way I can't shake. She paused, pen hovering above the page. Then, carefully, she wrote the words she wanted to remember most. Kindness is louder when no one's watching. Her chest eased as she read the line back. She underlined it once, gently, as though promising herself to keep it close. Sandra closed her eyes briefly, letting the pen rest between her fingers. The words on the page seemed to glow in the soft lamplight, carrying a truth she had felt, but never written down so clearly. She thought of the countless faces she had passed in airports, hotels, and restaurants. People who blended into the background, dismissed by the rush of the world. Her hand began moving again. I remember when I was younger, auditioning for roles no one thought I was suited for. I walked into rooms where I wasn't seen as worthy, just another girl in jeans. I told myself to endure, to outlast the stares and the quick judgments. Back then, I didn't have anyone to step in. I had to stand up for myself or walk away. She drew a small pause on the page before continuing. But what about the people who don't have that choice? The single mother just trying to pay her bills. The teacher who spends more on her students than she earns in a week. The janitor who cleans up messes no one ever thanks him for. These people are carrying stories larger than we can imagine. And yet, they are invisible to so many. She sat back, exhaling softly, the city lights winking through the rain. This week, the internet praised me and Keanu, but it isn't about us. It's about the people who don't trend, the ones who don't get recorded, the ones whose stories vanish into silence. She pressed the pen down with just enough pressure to leave the ink darker, her thoughts sharper now. Kindness isn't about the moments everyone sees. It's about the ones no one notices. Sandra let the pen slide from her hand, the page now covered with words that felt less like ink and more like fragments of her heart. She leaned back in the chair and stared at the last line she had written. Kindness isn't about the moments everyone sees. It's about the ones no one notices. She whispered it aloud, almost testing its weight in the quiet of the room. The sound carried, soft but steady, grounding her. Her thoughts shifted briefly to Heather. The memory of her cold tone lingered, but so did the image of her standing there, pale and trembling when Keanu spoke. Sandra wondered if Heather, too, was now sitting somewhere, replaying the night, feeling the weight of regret. Perhaps even writing in her own way. Sandra returned to her journal for one last sentence, one that closed the chapter, not with bitterness, but with resolve. Kindness is louder when no one's watching. She underlined the words and closed the book gently, sliding her hand across the leather cover. The act felt final, like sealing away not just the pain of the night, but the lesson it carried. She rose, turned off the lamp, and the suite fell into soft darkness. Crawling into bed, she pulled the blanket over her shoulders and let her body sink into the stillness. Her eyes drifted shut, not with the heaviness of defeat, but with the fragile comfort of knowing she had reclaimed something far more important than a room at a hotel. She had reclaimed her voice, and with that thought, sleep finally came. The breeze off Lake Michigan carried a cool bite, but the afternoon sun softened its edge. Waves lapped gently against the shoreline, their rhythm steady and calm, as if the water itself were offering a reminder of how the world endures beyond single moments. Sandra walked slowly along the paved trail, hands tucked into her coat pockets, her steps unhurried. Beside her, Keanu matched her pace, quiet as always, his gaze set on the horizon where the lake melted into the sky. They had both chosen this walk deliberately. After the storm of the previous night, the noise online and the countless headlines, they needed stillness. Out here, the only cameras were the passing joggers with earbuds in and families pushing strollers along the path. To most of the strangers they passed, they were simply two people taking a walk by the water. Sandra breathed deeply, the crisp air clearing her chest. "It feels good to be outside," she said softly. Keanu nodded. Sometimes silence heals more than walls ever could. They walked in companionable quiet for a while, their footsteps mingling with the gulls calling overhead. Finally, Sandra broke the silence. "You know, last night has been playing over in my mind, not because of what happened to me, but because of what it means." Keanu glanced at her, his eyes steady. "What does it mean to you?" "That we live in a world that still forgets to look deeper," she replied. "One hoodie, one tired face, and suddenly you're less than human. But also," she paused, searching for the right words, "it showed me how quickly things can shift when even one person decides to act differently." Keanu took that in, then said, "Maybe our job isn't just making movies." Sandra raised an eyebrow, curious. He continued, "Maybe it's reminding people how to treat each other. Maybe it's showing in the smallest ways that respect isn't optional, it's essential." Sandra let his words settle. The lake breeze tugged lightly at her hair as she considered them. "And maybe," she added softly, "our job is to remind people how to see each other. Not through fame, not through status, but through kindness." They shared a look then, one that carried years of friendship, shared experiences, and unspoken understanding. The water shimmered behind them, the city skyline rising tall in the distance. But in that moment, the world felt very small, very human, and very right. They continued down the path, their steps unhurried, their conversation stretching into the spaces between the sound of waves and the rustle of leaves along the shore. Sandra smiled faintly. "You know, I used to think moments like this didn't matter, that real change only happened on big stages, in speeches, in awards. But last night proved something else to me. Sometimes the smallest stage, a hotel lobby, can be where the loudest lessons are learned. Keanu nodded, his eyes on the shifting water. People remember moments that show truth. The lobby wasn't about fame. It was about respect. And respect is what lingers when everything else fades. Sandra's voice softened. It wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who has ever walked into a place and felt unseen. That's why it spread so fast. Not because I'm Sandra Bullock, but because people recognized their own stories in it. Keanu slowed his steps, pausing for a moment to take in the horizon. Power doesn't have to shout, he said quietly. Real power is silent when it's real. Sandra looked at him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the afternoon light. You're right. Maybe that's the lesson we both carry forward. They resumed walking, the words hanging in the air between them, not as a heavy burden, but as a quiet promise. Around them, the world continued as normal. Children laughed, joggers passed, the lake kept its rhythm. But for Sandra and Keanu, the silence meant something deeper. It was the silence of a story finished, but not forgotten. As they walked further along the trail, Sandra pulled her coat tighter, her mind circling back to the journal entry she had written the night before. She didn't mention it aloud, but Keanu seemed to sense the weight in her silence. He had a way of listening even when she wasn't speaking, of noticing pauses as much as words. She finally broke the quiet. Do you think people will forget about this by next week? Keanu shook his head gently. The internet moves on fast, but the people who needed to hear it won't forget. The ones who have been judged, the ones who have been silenced. They'll carry the reminder with them, and maybe the people who've done the judging will think twice next time. Sandra let out a soft laugh. That's a lot to hope for. Hope is where change starts, Keanu replied simply. They reached a pier that jutted out into the water. Sandra stopped, leaning against the railing, gazing out over the endless expanse of Blue Gay Lake. You know what I've realized? This isn't really about me. It's not even about Heather. It's about all the people no one sees. The ones who never trend. The ones who go home with the hurt still clinging to them. If last night did anything, I hope it reminded people that dignity shouldn't be negotiable. Keanu stood beside her, his hands resting on the railing as well. You said it perfectly last night, without even knowing. Kindness is louder when no one's watching. That's the lesson. That's the one people will remember. Sandra smiled faintly, her eyes glistening in the light. Then maybe our job really is bigger than acting. Maybe it's carrying these truths wherever we go, reminding people that the way they treat each other matters more than anything else. Keanu nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And maybe that's what friendship is too. Seeing each other when no one else does. The wind softened, carrying their words into the open air. The city behind them was busy and loud, but here, on the edge of the lake, there was only stillness. Only the gentle certainty that something meaningful had happened, not just for them, but for anyone willing to listen. They turned from the pier, walking back toward the path. And though they didn't say it, both carried the same thought in their hearts. Sometimes the quietest stand is the one that changes everything. As the story faded into the calm of the shoreline, a final truth lingered, carried by their steps and the wind over the lake. Power is silent when it's real. And now we leave you with 2 questions to carry forward. Have you ever seen someone judged unfairly because of how they looked? What would you do if you saw a moment like this in public? Tell us your incredible story.